She stood at the department store door in 1954, gloves already on, waiting for nobody in particular. A lady never walked through bare-handed. What else did every woman on that sidewalk simply know? Unspoken. Postwar America was rebuilding itself, and it rebuilt its manners right along with its kitchens. Amy Vanderbilt published her complete book of etiquette in 1952, and it landed in homes across the country next to the Bible and the dictionary. This was not decoration. It was a rule book nobody handed you, but everybody expected you to already know, whether you learned it from your mother, a magazine column, or simply from watching closely at every party you attended. Emily Post had already been at this for 30 years by the time the 50s began. Her book Etiquette first appeared in 1922, and by mid-century it had sold well over 1 million copies. Two women, Post and later Vanderbilt, effectively wrote the operating manual for how an entire generation of American women were supposed to move through public life. Here is the first rule nobody explains anymore. Gloves were not a fashion choice, short ones for daytime errands, church, the grocer, longer ones for an evening out. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it, and she also knew exactly when to take them off, and when leaving them on would have been the ruder move. The rule inside the rule was the part that tripped people up. Gloves stayed on for a handshake outdoors, on the street, at a garden party. But the moment she sat down to eat, or picked up a hand of bridge, or settled in for a long visit indoors, they came off. Readers wrote to magazine advice columns just to ask when exactly the gloves were supposed to come off at a cocktail party. Now picture the same woman walking into a restaurant and she never removes her hat. Men took theirs off the second they crossed a threshold. A woman kept hers on, indoors, at the table, in church, on a train. It is the exact opposite of the rule most people assume, and it turned every hat into a small, silent flag of gender and status the moment she walked in. Department stores built entire floors around this rule. Macy's and stores like it kept full millinery departments, staffed and stocked, because a woman without a hat downtown was as unusual as a woman without shoes. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works as a way to understand just how visible the etiquette of the era really was, stitched into the architecture of the stores themselves. Now here is where it gets interesting, because the handshake rule was not one rule, it was two, depending entirely on where she stood. Socially, at a party, meeting a man for the first time, she waited. She did not extend her hand first. It was his cue to give, not hers to take, and reaching out too quickly was read as forward, even a little presumptuous. But step into an office, and the rule flipped completely. Vanderbilt was explicit about this. A woman at work extended her hand first, because in that context, she was acting as a professional equal, not a guest at a party. Most people assume the 50s gave women one passive script for every room. They did not. The script changed the moment she walked through a different door. That distinction is easy to miss if you only remember the movies. The etiquette books of the era were quietly more complicated than the nostalgia reel suggests. A woman was expected to read the room, identify which set of rules applied, and switch between them without a moment of visible hesitation. That itself was the skill being taught, far more than any single gesture ever was. Now, the calling card. Small, engraved, about the size of a playing card, and by the early 1950s already considered a little old-fashioned, even by the women who still used one. It survived longest in cities like Washington and Boston, among families who had been doing this for 3 generations and were not about to stop for a war or two. The ritual worked like this. A woman calling on another household left her card, sometimes with a corner turned down to signal she had come in person rather than sent it by servant or messenger. If the lady of the house was not receiving visitors that day, the card simply sat on a small silver tray in the hall, a quiet record of who had come and who had not yet been received. By the 1960s, this whole system was gone from ordinary life. It had already been fading through the 50s, a formal leftover from an older world colliding with a new suburban one where women were more likely to phone ahead than send a card by hand. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore, and the calling card is one of the clearest fossils of it. Thank you notes were treated with a seriousness that would startle most people today. A woman was expected to write hers within a day or two of any dinner, gift, or overnight stay, not whenever she got around to it. Hostesses noticed. They remembered who wrote promptly and who let a week slip by, and it quietly shaped who got invited back. This is why personal stationery, often monogrammed with a young woman's initials, was such a common wedding or graduation gift. It was not sentimental packaging. It was a practical tool she was going to need constantly, the same way you might give someone a good set of kitchen knives today because you knew exactly how often they would reach for it. Now let's talk about the table, because this is where the rules got dense fast. There were two accepted ways to eat with a fork and knife: the continental style, where the fork stayed in the left hand the entire meal, and the American style, where she cut with the knife in her right hand, then switched the fork over to eat. Here is the part almost nobody remembers. It did not matter which style she used. What mattered was that she picked one and stayed with it for the entire meal. Switching back and forth mid-dinner was the real offense, because it signaled an upbringing that had never quite settled into a system. Consistency was the actual manners. The specific style was almost beside the point. At a private dinner party, nobody touched a fork until the hostess did. It was called the Hostess Rule, and it quietly handed the woman of the house real control over the entire evening's pace. In a decade often remembered as male-dominated at every level, the timing of an entire dinner party rested in one woman's hands, and everyone at that table waited on her signal. A woman never sat down before she was shown to her seat, and she waited for a man to pull out her chair before she settled in. It reads today like pure formality. At the time, it functioned as a small, repeated signal of attentiveness, passing back and forth between two people. A tiny choreography performed at nearly every meal, every single day. Posture had its own quiet rulebook, too. Feet together or crossed neatly at the ankle, never at the knee, never splayed wide. It sounds small until you realize this exact posture is drilled into charm school curricula across the decade, illustrated in etiquette books, and corrected gently by mothers at every family gathering from age 8 onward, until it stopped being a lesson and simply became how a woman sat. Charm schools were a real, physical institution of this decade, not a myth invented later by nostalgia. Teenage girls practiced walking with a book balanced on their heads. They practiced entering a room, exiting a room, shaking hands, setting a table. It was treated with the same seriousness as learning to drive, because in a sense, it was training for the same kind of independence. Some department stores ran their own charm programs for teenage customers, part manners lesson, part marketing, teaching girls how to walk, how to shake hands, how to make polite conversation with a stranger at a counter. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down, and a surprising amount of it she likely learned standing in a department store classroom on a Saturday afternoon. Introductions followed their own strict order, and getting it backward was a genuine, noticeable mistake. The younger person was presented to the older. In a mixed social setting, a man was typically presented to a woman, not the other way around. Mrs. Jones, may I present Mr. Smith, not the reverse. It sounds like a small detail. At the time, it was the entire structure holding a first meeting together. Here is one that surprises almost everyone. A lady did not smoke while walking down the street, seated at a table, at a party, in a restaurant, perfectly acceptable. Cigarette in hand while walking past the shop windows downtown, considered fast, common, a mark against her. No such rule applied to a man doing the exact same thing on the exact same sidewalk. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works as a window into how differently the same public street could be read depending on who was moving through it. A rule like this was never written into law. It lived entirely in glances, in whispered comment, in whether a woman was invited back to the next gathering, and that made it, in some ways, harder to break than any actual law would have been. A married woman's own name barely appeared on paper. Envelopes, formal introductions, the social register, all of it used her husband's full name instead. Mrs. John A. Smith, never Mrs. Jane Smith. It felt completely ordinary at the time, taught without comment right alongside every other rule in the book. Said out loud today in a modern living room, it tends to land like a small shock. It is worth pausing here because this rule is easy to read as pure erasure, and there is truth in that reading, but it also functioned inside a social system where a household, not an individual, was the unit being addressed. Understanding that does not make the rule feel modern. It does make it easier to see why so few people questioned it at the time. Makeup and grooming had their own strict boundary. A woman never reapplied lipstick, checked her hair, or powdered her nose at the table, whether in a restaurant or someone's dining room. She excused herself to the powder room instead. This rule had enough staying power that etiquette columns were still repeating it well into the 1960s, long after other rules had already started to loosen. It is a small rule, but it tells you something bigger about the era's whole philosophy of manners. The point was never to hide who you were. The point was to keep certain private processes private so that public time together stayed focused on conversation and company, not on the small mechanics of appearance nobody at the table particularly needed to watch unfold. Amy Vanderbilt herself is worth knowing because she complicates the whole picture people carry around about this decade. She was a working journalist with a public byline, not a quiet homemaker handing down folk wisdom. She went on to host her own radio and television programs about manners well into the 50s and 60s, a career woman writing the rule book for other women. That detail matters. The most influential etiquette voice of the decade was not preaching domestic passivity from the sidelines. She was actively working, publishing, broadcasting, building a career, while also writing the definitive guide to how a woman should carry herself at a dinner party. The two lives were not seen as contradictions. They were seen as the same skill set, applied in two different rooms. Emily Post's own definition of etiquette is easy to miss because most people only remember the rules, never the reasoning behind them. She framed good manners as consideration for other people first, not a performance meant to impress them. That framing cuts hard against the modern caricature of the era as pure snobbery dressed up in white gloves and a stiff, unforgiving smile. Good manners remember, even when we forget. The rule was never about which fork to use for its own sake. It was about making sure the person across the table, especially a nervous guest or a stranger, never had to feel unsure of themselves in your home. That is a genuinely different goal than the one most people assume this whole system was built around. This is also why etiquette manuals spent so much space on conversation itself, not just silverware. How to gently redirect an awkward topic, how to draw a quiet guest into the discussion without embarrassing them, how to exit a conversation with someone dull without ever seeming rude. These were treated as real, teachable skills, practiced and refined, not just an instinct a woman was born already knowing. Ladies' Home Journal and magazines like it ran regular etiquette question columns, and the questions readers actually sent in prove how tricky the fine print really was. Can I take my gloves off to eat a canapé at a cocktail party? Do I write a separate thank you note for each guest at a joint shower? These were not hypothetical puzzles. Women needed the answers for that Saturday night. That detail alone should put to rest the idea that these women simply absorbed the rules effortlessly, as though good manners were some kind of natural built-in instinct. They studied it, they wrote in for clarification, they compared notes with friends over the phone before a dinner party. This was an actively maintained system, not a passive inheritance, and it required real, ongoing effort to keep up with. It is also worth being honest about who this rule book was actually written for. Most of the best-selling etiquette guides targeted an aspirational, largely white, middle to upper middle class, urban and suburban reader. Working-class women, rural women, and women of color were navigating entirely different social codes, often stricter, often unwritten in any best-selling book at all, and worth remembering honestly rather than smoothing over. That does not erase what this channel is here to remember. It just means the version most people picture, the calling cards and the gloves and the hostess rule, was one specific slice of American life, a widely aspirational one, but not the only script a woman in this decade was living by, and we should say that plainly rather than pretend otherwise. There is a reason these rules functioned as more than decoration in a world before easy background checks or digital records. Knowing the code and demonstrating it fluently worked like a fast, informal credential. A woman who wrote a proper thank you note, who introduced people correctly, who handled a fork with consistency, signaled reliability to strangers in seconds before a single real conversation had even happened. That is easy to lose sight of today in a world of instant messages and profiles that tell you everything about a stranger before you meet them. In 1953, a woman's manners were often the only information anyone had about her in the first 60 seconds. The rules were not vanity. They were, in a very real sense, a form of communication. Let's return to the table for a moment, because there was a rule about napkins almost nobody remembers correctly today. A woman unfolded her napkin only after being seated, placed it fully across her lap, never tucked into a collar, and if she left the table briefly, she set it loosely on her chair, never balled up on the table itself. A balled-up napkin left on the table signaled the meal and the company were finished and no longer worth minding. A napkin on the chair said quietly, "I am coming back. Please carry on without me." It is a small piece of choreography, but it meant every guest at that table always knew exactly where things stood without a single word being spoken. There was also a specific rule for accepting a compliment. A lady said a simple thank you and stopped there. She did not deflect it, argue with it, or launch into a long explanation of why the compliment wasn't quite deserved. Modest self-deprecation, oddly, was considered slightly rude because it forced the other person to keep working to convince her. That rule alone contradicts a lot of what people assume about 50s femininity, which is often pictured as reflexively self-effacing. The actual instruction was closer to the opposite: accept it cleanly, gracefully, and move the conversation along. Fumbling and deflecting was the social error, not confidence, and it was treated as its own small failure of poise, a habit worth correcting before it became noticeable. Letter writing itself followed a strict register depending on who was receiving it. A note to a close friend could be warm and casual. A note to an older relative, a new acquaintance's mother, or anyone of higher social standing required a more formal opening and closing. Specific phrases that signaled respect without ever needing to state it outright, learned early and rarely written down. This is part of why penmanship itself mattered so much. Handwriting was taught and corrected as its own discipline in school, because a letter was often the only version of a woman a distant relative or new acquaintance ever encountered. Sloppy handwriting on fine monogrammed stationery was its own small, visible contradiction nobody wanted to be caught in, an easy tell that the rest of the effort hadn't quite matched. Now think about the telephone, still a relatively new fixture of daily life for many households in this decade. A woman answered with her own name or the household's name, never just hello, and she kept calls reasonably brief if she suspected someone might be waiting to use the line, since many households still shared a single phone with a whole street of neighbors on a party line. This is a small, easy-to-overlook detail, but it is a good reminder that etiquette was never only about grand dinner parties. It reached into the smallest daily interactions, the phone call, the doorstep, the grocery counter, shaping how a woman moved through an entire ordinary day, not just the rare formal evening she spent months looking forward to and preparing for. Travel had its own dress code entirely. A woman dressed for an afternoon train or an early flight the way she might dress for church, gloves, hat, a tailored coat, because travel itself was treated as a public occasion worth presenting yourself properly for, not the anonymous, sweatpants and headphones experience travel has largely become today. It is worth sitting with that contrast for a moment. Getting somewhere was not treated as dead time to survive. It was still a public appearance, still governed by the same unwritten expectations as any other room she might walk into that day. The idea of comfort over presentation, so normal now, would have struck most of these women as a strange trade to make. Grocery shopping was still, in many neighborhoods, a social occasion in its own right, and a woman was expected to greet the butcher, the grocer, and any neighbor she passed by name with a brief, genuine exchange, not a hurried nod. It built the kind of small-town familiarity that made an entire block function almost like an extended household. Everyone accounted for, everyone recognized. That kind of daily familiarity is part of what modern viewers often say they miss most when they talk about this era, even more than the specific rules themselves. It was not really about the gloves or the hats in the end. It was about a world where everyone agreed on a shared set of small courtesies, and that agreement made ordinary interactions feel safer, warmer, and far less like guesswork. There was also a very specific rule about arriving at a party. A woman never arrived exactly on time, and certainly never early. 10 to 15 minutes past the stated hour was considered correct, giving the hostess a small cushion to finish her final preparations without a guest standing in the doorway watching her do it, apron still on, hair not quite set. This is one of those rules that sounds like pure fussiness until you notice the actual purpose hiding underneath it. It was not about status or fashion. It was a practical courtesy that protected the hostess from ever being caught unprepared in front of her own guests. One more example of etiquette designed to spare someone else discomfort, not to create it. RSVP rules were treated with real weight too, far more than most modern gatherings enforce. Responding within a few days of receiving an invitation was expected, and simply not showing up without ever replying was considered one of the sharper social offenses a woman could commit. The kind of lapse that got remembered for years, not just one awkward evening. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works. And it is worth asking honestly whether that particular rule ever really needed to go. A hostess planning food, seating, and space for a specific number of guests was solving a real logistical problem, one that a firm, timely RSVP made dramatically easier to plan around, instead of guessing right up until the doorbell rang. Even grief had its own etiquette, handled with a formality that feels almost startling now. A widow wore black or dark, muted colors for a defined mourning period, and friends were expected to call briefly, express condolences plainly, and never linger too long or ask probing questions about how she was truly holding up underneath the composed, expected face she wore. That structure gave grief a shape, a defined period with visible signals, so that an entire community knew exactly how to behave around someone in mourning without ever having to ask her directly. It is easy to romanticize and easy to critique as rigid. It also solved a real problem that most of us today are left to navigate with no shared script at all. Wedding gift etiquette followed its own precise timeline. A gift was expected within the year following the wedding. Sooner was better, and it was always accompanied by a card, never dropped off or mailed anonymously. Registries as we know them barely existed yet. A woman was expected to know the couple well enough to choose something genuinely useful without being told exactly what to buy. That last part is easy to overlook. Choosing a thoughtful gift without a registry to lean on required actually knowing the couple, their taste, their new household's needs. It turned gift-giving into a genuine act of attention, rather than the efficient checklist it can become today. One more small place where the era's manners quietly demanded real relationship, not just correct form. There was even a rule for how a woman was supposed to enter a room already full of people, especially a room where she knew almost no one. She paused briefly at the threshold, located the hostess first, greeted her before anyone else, and let the hostess guide the first introduction rather than pushing her own way into a conversation already underway. That small pause at the doorway did real work. It signaled respect for the hostess's authority over her own gathering, and it gave the room a natural, unforced moment to notice a new arrival without anyone having to announce it loudly. Small choreography like this repeats constantly across the etiquette manuals of the decade, always solving the same underlying problem: how to make a room feel comfortable rather than chaotic. Some of these rules genuinely earned their disappearance, and it is worth saying that plainly rather than dodging it. The rigid dress codes for a simple errand, the strict gendered handshake rule, the erasure of a married woman's own first name on an envelope, these reflected real limits placed on women that most of us are glad to have left behind. But other rules did not disappear because they were wrong. They disappeared because the whole culture that maintained them, the shared expectations, the charm schools, the etiquette columns everyone actually read, simply stopped being reinforced. The thank you note, the RSVP, the hostess who signals when a meal begins, none of those ever stopped being useful. They just stopped being taught. It is a useful distinction to sit with. Not every unwritten rule this channel covers deserves to come back exactly as it was, but the instinct underneath most of them: make the other person comfortable, signal respect clearly, follow through on a small promise like a reply or a thank you. That instinct never actually went out of date at all. By the mid-1960s, most of this had already started sliding away. Betty Friedan's writing landed in 1963 and gave language to a frustration many women had been quietly carrying for years, and the youth culture of that decade openly pushed back against formality of every kind. Gloves included, hats included, calling cards very much included, all of it suddenly seeming like a relic of somebody else's rules. It did not vanish overnight. The decline stretched across most of the 60s. Decade by decade, the hats came off, the gloves stayed in drawers, the calling cards moved from silver trays into shoeboxes in attics. By the 70s, almost none of it remained in ordinary daily life, except in the most formal or diplomatic settings where old habits held on a little longer. Here is something worth knowing about right now, in your own moment. There has been a genuine surge of interest in exactly this kind of content across the internet these last few years. Formal table settings, handwritten letters, dress codes, all of it framed as a quiet rebellion against a world that feels increasingly rushed, informal, and mediated entirely through a screen. That is not nothing. It suggests these old codes were not simply arbitrary constraints people are relieved to be free of. Many of them were solving a real, still unsolved problem: how to make strangers comfortable quickly, how to signal reliability without saying a word, how to give a gathering a shared rhythm everyone could trust from the very first moment. Career advice and dating advice aimed at younger adults today has started borrowing this exact language: thank you notes, firm handshakes, showing up on time, often explicitly citing what our grandparents knew as the hook. The specific forms have changed. The underlying need for a shared, legible code of behavior clearly has not gone anywhere at all. That is exactly why the estate sale table, the box of monogrammed stationery, the pair of white gloves folded in tissue paper in a grandmother's dresser still stop people in their tracks today. They are not just objects, they are the last physical fingerprints of an entire system for moving through the world with intention, one careful gesture at a time. So the next time you see a pair of folded gloves in an old dresser drawer or a stack of engraved cards tucked into a shoebox, you are not looking at outdated fussiness. You are looking at a working system, refined over decades, built by women who understood something about consideration and consistency that a lot of us are still quietly relearning today. The rule was never written down, but every woman in the room knew it, and that is really the whole story of this channel in a single sentence. If this took you back to your own grandmother's parlor or taught you something she never got the chance to explain, stay a while longer. There is always another forgotten rule waiting to be remembered here.